As a visitor to London, it is highly recommended to use the London Transport Network to get to the hundreds of sites and attractions, and it transports millions of people every week as they commute to and from work. One part of the London Transport Network is the London Overground. This suburban railway serves many of the districts and is a mix of overground and underground services. But if you travel between Rotherhithe and Rappin, part of your journey will include one of the oldest subaqueous tunnels ever built, and 150 years ago, you could walk through it. As the import of goods into the City of London was getting greater during the latter part of the 18th century, the city was facing a problem. It was growing, but it was dissected by the River Thames. The river was a blessing and a curse. It brought goods right to everyone's doorstep and was deep enough it could take larger ships, but it did split the city into two. The solution, many thought, was obvious: build a bridge. Bridges over the Thames were common, but each bridge had to make accommodations to allow the tall sailing ships to pass underneath. But bridges of this calibre were expensive and impractical, and with more people coming to live in the city, boats and the current bridges were clearly not enough. The talk of a tunnel under the Thames started in the late 1700s. A tunnel made sense. It would get the workers right into the heart of the growing dockyards without any interruption to the ships, and it would cause less disruption than building a bridge. It was a daring plan. Few had ever attempted a tunnel under a river before, and none were successful. There was rumoured to be an ancient one under the Palace of Babylon, but no one really knows whether it was real or just a fantasy. Ralph Dodd was the first to attempt a tunnel under the Thames. He had several engineering tenders in London and was renowned to be rather successful. He had attempted an underwater tunnel before and put his plans forward, but the Ordnance Office were not convinced, citing that the design was flawed. Dodd pushed through with the plan anyway, but was forced to abandon it when the tunnel started to flood and not even the modern steam pumps could save it. The plan was put aside until 1805, when engineer Richard Trevithick decided to give it a go himself. He decided that the site Dodd had selected were not suitable and proposed a different site between Rotherhithe and Rappin. He called it the Thames Archway Project. It was a simple idea. He would use Cornish miners to dig down a central pilot hole to the bedrock. Then they opened up into a tunnel and used bricks to hold up the structure. But when the Cornish men dug, instead of solid stone that they were used to, the ground was soft with pockets of quicksand. It were no good. The miners were simply not used to the soil, and after only digging a few hundred metres, the project was abandoned yet again. It was feared that the dream of a tunnel under the Thames would be impossible, but the Archway Company was still hopeful that there was an answer somewhere and offered a reward of £500 to anyone who could complete the project. Marc Brunel was born in France in 1769 and was the son of a farmer. They fled to America in the French Revolution, where Marc began to have an interest in engineering. He grew up to be the engineer of New York City. He soon moved to the UK and set up in the town of Portsea with his wife and was involved making new pulley blocks for the Royal Navy's many ships. He soon branched into the mechanical steam industry and made machines for a variety of uses. From yarn to making boots, his goal was to streamline the industries. It was the boot making business that almost brought Marc down. He was given an order anyone would have dreamed of, an order for boots for the whole British Army. His machines could fulfil the order no problem, and he put his entire capital into the project. But after the Battle of Waterloo, the army quibbled over paying the bill. On top of this, one of his sawmills burnt to the ground. Faced with no money and debts mounting, Marc and his wife found themselves in debtor's prison and was only saved when the Duke of Wellington, hearing of their plight, cleared their debts so that they could be released. Meanwhile, as the gears of industry were turning, London were growing and more people were moving than ever. Brunel was intrigued by the tunnel problem and he couldn't help but plan a solution. By 1818, he was ready to take his plan to the Institution of Civil Engineers, and in a meeting to investors, he was given the green light. Once again, the spot between Rotherhithe and Rappin were chosen, and work started in 1825. The site was not the best for digging, but it was the best for road links without causing too much disruption. Knowing that a shaft down was required, and knowing that the problems Trevivick had had with the soft soil, a 50-foot iron ring was built on the surface. The iron ring had several purposes. It allowed the workers to use it as a template and a stable foundation for a cylindrical brick wall that were built on top of it. It provided a stable base for a steam engine that would power pumps to keep the water out. And lastly, the weight of it and the bricks would help drive the whole thing downward. The underneath of the ring was sharp, and workers would dig at the loose soil around it. Combined with the ever-increasing weight of the wall and the removal of the soil at the base, the whole shaft sank. There was one small point where the shaft came stuck as the soil held up against the weight of the bricks, so 50,000 bricks were built on top and its weight got things moving again. To stop this happening at the other end, the Rappin shaft isn't entirely cylindrical and has more diameter at the bottom than it does at the top. Once the shaft was completed and shored up, would the real works really begin? Knowing that typical mining techniques were not going to work, Marc devised a shield out of iron. The shield would go against the excavation wall and had 36 cells where a single man stood. Wooden boards separated the men from the excavation wall, and as each man removed the board, they dug as far as they could. They replaced the board back against the wall and held it there with props. Once the whole section was dug, bricklayers would move in and line the outer wall, after which the shield was pushed forward and the process would begin again. The working conditions could only be described as rancid. The men were not just digging through centuries of old riverbed, but they were also digging under one of the largest running open sewers. Sewerage, rubbish, dead animals, and almost anything foul you can imagine went into that river. Most of it ended up buried on the river bed. Methane was a constant threat, and it wasn't long before the men, including Marc himself, got very sick. The chief engineer got so ill, Marc's son Isambard had no choice but to take over the work at just the age of 20. When he came of age at 21, he celebrated by having a party with his friends in the tunnel. In 1827, following a successful repair of a breach by the way of a diving bell, Isambard himself held a banquet, not only to prove the tunnel was indeed safe, but to credit his workers' endeavours. In 1828, a breach in the tunnel wall nearly spelt the end for Isambard. He and a group of men were shoring up the tunnel wall near the shield when the wall caved and the water from the river flooded through. The men were swept off their feet by the sheer force of the wave. Isambard and two other men were crushed under a platform, but he managed to wriggle free and he called to the others to get to the shaft. In total darkness, the men scrambled 600 feet in the freezing water for the only way out, the stairs. Battered and broken, Isambard tried to swim to safety, but before he could make it, a second wave hit him. The wave was so powerful, it carried him along the length of the tunnel. It hit the shaft wall with so much force that the wave carried on upwards and out, carrying the now unconscious engineer with it. 6 men would perish in the tunnel breach, and Isambard was sent to Brighton to recuperate. He had a badly injured leg, internal injuries and hemorrhaging, but amazingly he pulled through. It took a long time to recover, but as soon as he was able, he continued to plan the tunnel. Isambard moved to Clifton to both continue his recovery and to help tender his first true project on his own, a new bridge across the Avon. From there he helped charter more works, eventually helping with the setup of the railways in that area. Back in London, Marc had to continue without his son's help, but it took 7 years for additional funds to be procured and for the works to begin again. The breaches were repaired, a new, stronger shield was built, and the water was pumped away. By the time the tunnel was finished in 1843, Marc was in his 70s and recovering from a stroke, but he still attended and was the first to greet Her Majesty as she walked through the tunnel for the first time. The workers, some still recovering from illness, lined the tunnel and would give applause or cheers as she greeted them. After the tunnel opened, Marc retired to his home in Westminster, but sadly passed away 6 years later at the age of 81. The tunnel was opened up and was designed to take horse and carriages. However, the shaft's descents, designed to take the horses to the sub-level, were never built due to lack of funding. But the public didn't seem to mind walking and would marvel at the fact that they were walking under the river. But as the years passed, the novelty wore off, and the tunnel's dim lighting was the perfect haunt for people with less than lawful tendencies. As word got around, it became less of an attraction and more of a hindrance. In 1865, the tunnel was sold to the East London Railway. The railway was an amalgamation of 6 railways, and the tunnel would provide the perfect ready-made route for its new line. The tunnel's height and width would easily take trains, and although Marc and his son never intended it for railways, the tunnel was repurposed. Interestingly, the person to engineer the tunnel's use was the same man who finished Isambard's first project, the Clifton Suspension Bridge. The tunnel was the oldest part of the underground system, and when the railway merged into the London Underground, it remained a part of the network for over 100 years, relatively untouched, with the world evolving around it. In 1995, the tunnel was in bad need of maintenance, and construction on the line elsewhere necessitated its closure. In 100 years, the tunnel was holding up fairly well, but there were signs of its age. The bricks were loose, and there were signs of cracking. Rather than repairing the brickwork using sympathetic techniques, the contractors wanted to use a technique called shotcreting. Shotcreting uses a spray gun to spray concrete onto the walls at high velocity. The concrete is a sticky consistency, and the rough brick surface was the ideal host. The concrete would act as a shield. It was strong, durable, and ideal for the job, but it came at a price. The beautiful brickwork, arches, and the architecture would be completely buried and impossible to recover. Conservationists, architects, and historians were horrified at the plan and petitioned to conserve the tunnel as it was. In the end, the conservationists won, and in March 1995, the tunnel was recognised as a Grade 2 listed building. The contractors had no choice but to put the concrete gun aside. Instead, the contractors had to build a new concrete inner lining with a new waterproof membrane sandwiched between it and the brickwork. The concrete lining would help structure the tunnel, while the membrane stopped any leaks within it. To help preserve the brickwork, the water is channeled into a brand new drainage system. The inner lining can be removed if required should the need arise, and replaced if necessary. At the end of the tunnel, it remained untreated, so conservationists and the occasional architect or tourist can see the brickwork in its glory. It was opened in 1997 and ran again for another 10 years. In 2007, the tunnel was closed again, this time not for repairs, but for a new track to be relayed and new signals could be installed. While the tunnel was closed, it was open for several lucky visitors who walked the tunnel once again. And in 2010, it was separated from the London Underground to become the oldest part of the London Overground system, and has been a part of that railway ever since. The tunnel and its 2 pedestrian entrances are still an active part of London today. Of course, the tunnel plays a part in the overground system. However, there are rare occasions where the London Transport Museum are able to offer tours and walks through the tunnel, just as pedestrians did over 150 years ago. Usually planned around maintenance, these tours only happen across a few days every few years or so it's best to keep an eye on the London Transport Museum website for dates and times. If you can't get tickets, the museum offers a multitude of tours, including several old secret platforms and parts of the underground people very rarely see. In Rotherhithe, the public access tunnel is now home to the Brunel Museum. This quirky, unusual museum takes you through the history of the construction of the tunnel, its history, and an insight into what the men faced. You travel literally in the footsteps of the past as you take the same route as the early Victorians. The museum also gives you an alternate access to see the tunnel as the trains rumble around you. The other end of the tunnel is now the Rappin Overground station. As you descend to the platform, the twin tunnels can be seen in the distance. However, this platform must be navigated carefully. It's very narrow and can get very busy very quickly. The Brunel Museum has no doubt got to be on my go-to list when I go back to London. From what I've heard, the museum space is amazing and the tunnel shaft is perfect for holding events and even the odd concert. It's not too far-fetched from what Isambard had done. If he could hold an event and even a banquet or two, I think he would have approved on how his and his father's legacy is still being useful, and thanks to the railway, finally realising his father's vision of bringing the two halves of London closer together than ever before.